Today I'm going to be telling you about one of my naval heroes, and this is a man that isn't very well known at all, which surprises me because he was the most successful naval sea captain, wartime sea captain in history. He was a bit of a rebel, and he improvised all the time. He modernized warfare. He did alienate all his superiors during his time, but he is one of the great heroes of naval warfare, and I wanted to tell you about him today. Many of you may have read stories or books about him, or seen TV series or movies which feature some of the fictional accounts of his real-life adventures. So today I'd like to introduce you to Lord Sir Thomas Cochrane of the Royal Navy. Anyone heard of him? Okay, well, once again, we're going to learn something today, which is great. So he was born in Scotland in 1775 to Scottish nobility. He was the first of 7 sons, and all of those sons went on to have magnificent careers in either the British military or in diplomatic service. Now, when I say Scottish nobility, it was a noble family, but it wasn't a very wealthy family. His father, the 9th Earl of Dundonald, saw himself as a bit of an inventor. He had a lot of patents that he had applied for, but most of the inventions that he did were not commercially viable, and after a while he had to sell large portions of his estates in Scotland to pay off debts. So the family wasn't all that well off. Now, at the being the first son, the father wanted young Thomas to follow in his footsteps and join the army, whereas young Thomas from a very early age had always dreamed about joining the Royal Navy. But he had to follow his father's wishes. He enrolled in military college, and after the first year of studies, when the exams were done, despite his obvious intelligence, Thomas's scores were way down below at the bottom of the class. So his father, who was embarrassed by this, relented and allowed him to transfer over to the Royal Navy, and he joined the Navy as a midshipman at the age of 17, which was quite old for a midshipman at that time. Most midshipmen joined as 13, 14, 15-year-olds at the time, so 17 was quite mature. And he didn't really fit the mould of the other midshipmen. He would spend a lot of time with the ordinary seamen, literally learning the ropes and how to handle these ships, learning from the men, and he had a great rapport with the ordinary sailors aboard these ships. But when he joined, this was just in time for the French Revolutionary War, and of course this is the war where Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette were deposed, and them, along with 16,594 French noblemen and women, went to meet Madame Guillotine for the very first and last time. But he joined HMS Hind, which was commanded by his uncle, another Thomas Cochrane, and they had a lot of success against the French. They were able to capture 8 French ships and also recapture a British ship that had been captured by the French. Now, I explained the other day about how more beneficial it was to capture a vessel rather than destroy it. Back in those days, if you captured a vessel, you would put a prize crew on board. That prize crew would sail off to a friendly port, and the Admiralty would either purchase that ship or they would sell it. The Admiralty would receive a commission from it, but the rest of the proceeds were split up 3 ways. The captain of the ship that captured the vessel would receive 1/3 of the remaining money. The officers would all share the second third, and all the enlisted men, the other sailors, would share the last third of that prize. And this was a way to make sure that British seamen were more aggressive than other seamen around the world. They were going looking for opportunities to capture vessels. They were looking for opportunities to join in battle. And it also supplemented the wages, which were very ordinary wages at that time for these sailors. To take a prize was the ultimate goal. Now, in 1796, he was promoted to lieutenant, and then 2 years later, he was promoted to 8th lieutenant aboard HMS Barflower. Now, this was a very significant promotion because Barflower was the flagship of the British Navy during the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary War, and the Napoleonic Wars. It was a first-rate ship of the line with 98 guns, and as the flagship, if you were promoted to the flagship, it meant that someone wanted to keep an eye on you. You had potential, and so you were always under scrutiny there. You were going places in the Navy. But while he was serving on the Bowfleur, he got into trouble. Is that someone volunteering then? Okay, I'll keep it. He got into trouble with the first lieutenant. He was actually charged and court-martialed on a charge of flippancy. He was found guilty. He got a slap over the wrist. But Philip Beaver, the first officer, the first lieutenant, he was actually also reprimanded for being a bit precious. But this wasn't going to be the last time that Cochrane would fall foul of petty authority. It was going to be a mark of his later career. In February 1800, he received his first command, and this was as command of a prize ship. So the Bowfleur, the fleet, had captured a prize ship. Cochrane was put on board with a very small crew to sail this prize ship back to a friendly port. Now, as they were sailing back, they were hit by a huge storm, and they had to reef in the sails, take in the sails so that the vessel wouldn't capsize. One of the men, because they didn't have many crew, one of the men fell from the yardarms as he was trying to bring in these sails. He was seriously injured. Without a moment's hesitation, Cochrane climbed into the rigging himself and helped these men bring in the sails. Now that was something that officers didn't do at that time, and it gave him the reputation amongst the fleet that he wouldn't order someone to do something that he wouldn't do himself. It really enhanced his reputation amongst the ordinary sailors in the fleet. And then he was given command of HMS Speedy, which was a tiny, tiny ship, a little two-masted brig. It only had 14 very small guns. These guns only fired 4-pound shots, so not very big at all. Cochrane was not impressed with this ship at all. He said that he was 6 foot tall, which was very tall for that time, and it only had a maximum of 5 feet of headroom below deck. So he had to be crouched over the whole time he was below decks. And he complained that he could carry a whole broadside of ammunition in his pockets because they were only 7 4-pound shots. So very, very small. But Speedy turned out to be what was referred to as a very lucky ship. Cochrane had a lot of success with it, but so did every other captain that captained the Speedy. In fact, the other 5 captains of the Speedy also had remarkable careers in the Royal Navy. All of them went on to become admirals of the Royal Navy. So a very, very lucky ship. And the Speedy had a lot of success, first of all, under Cochrane. They had lots of adventures aboard the Speedy. One of the early ones was when they came across a Spanish vessel, much more powerful than the Speedy. The Spanish had the wind in their favour. There was no way that the Speedy was going to defeat this vessel. So Cochrane did a tactic that he often used, a false flag. He ran up the Danish flag, and then he ran up a flag indicating that there was plague on board. He got an officer to come out dressed as a Danish officer and shouting to the Spanish, come and help us, because we've got plague on board. The Spanish obviously didn't want anything to do with that, and they sailed away, and the Speedy was saved. On another occasion, they were being pursued by a French frigate, once again much more powerful than they were. Cochrane was able to avoid the frigate or evade the frigate all through the day, but when night fell, he did something innovative. He put a lantern on a barrel, tied a lantern to a barrel, lit the lamp. He put the barrel in the water and let it float away. He doused the lights on his ship, changed course, so the French followed the light on the barrel, thinking that was the Speedy. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Master and Commander, which is on the TV in your stateroom, you'll see a very similar story in that movie where Jack Aubrey, who's the commander of HMS Speedy, played by Russell Crowe, does the same thing. He's pursued by a much more powerful ship. He builds a raft and puts lamps on that, changes direction, and the French follow the bait, and he's able to escape. So that's a work of fiction based on a true experience of Cochrane. But in May 6, 1801, he had his greatest victory aboard the Speedy, and that's when he came across the Spanish vessel, the El Gamo. This was a much more powerful vessel again. It had 32 much larger guns and a crew of 319 against the Speedy's 14 small 4-pound guns with a crew of only 54 men. Now, Cochrane knew that if the El Gamo was able to get free into the Mediterranean and attack the British convoys, it would cause a lot of damage. So he thought he had to take action. Once again, he used false flags. He ran up the American flag this time and indicated to the El Gamo that he wanted to confer with them. He wanted to talk to them. And when he got right alongside, he struck the Stars and Stripes, raised the British ensign, and opened fire with grape shot on the crew of the El Gamo. Now, grape shot is a bit like a shotgun, so it sprays out and decimated the crew on the El Gamo. Now, when those Spaniards realised that this was a British ship, they ran to their cannons. They tried to fire at the Speedy, but because it was so close to them and it was so small compared to the El Gamo, when they fired their cannons, it went over the top of the Speedy. They couldn't elevate their cannons enough to be able to hit the Speedy. But on one cannonball did take Cochrane's hat off at one stage. So whenever the Spaniards would rush to congregate to try and board the Speedy, it was so close to them, Cochrane would pull off by about 10 metres and once again fire grape shot into the congregated Spanish, decimating their ranks. And then when they ran back to their guns, he would bring the Speedy alongside again and keep hammering them as much as he could. And eventually he decimated the Spanish crew so much that he came up alongside and he said to his men, "This is it, men, now or never, it's either them or us." And his men boarded the El Gamo, and even though it was odds of 6-1, they were able to defeat and capture the El Gamo. Once again, he did something that was very innovative. He sent 4 men, even though he needed those men for the battle because they were severely outnumbered. He sent 4 men to the rear or the stern of the El Gamo to take down the Spanish flag. When the Spaniards saw the flag come down, they thought that the battle had been lost and they were surrendering, so they surrendered as well, and he was able to capture the El Gamo. Now, this was massive news back in England because he'd attacked and beaten such a large adversary. The press couldn't get enough of this. The public couldn't get enough of Cochrane and the Speedy. And over the next 13 months, they had a lot of success. In fact, they either captured, destroyed, or damaged 53 ships in 13 months. So that's on average about a ship per week that they were able to damage or destroy or capture. And once again, the British public couldn't get enough of this. It became like a serial in the paper. Every week there was a story about Cochrane and the Speedy, and he became very, very famous and very popular back in England. Not so much popular with the Admiralty though, because of that fame and the jealousy amongst other officers as well. Now, we used a lot of innovative tactics during this time. One of the tactics he used was because the Speedy was so small, it could get in very, very close to the coastline. And then when there was an outgoing tide and an outgoing wind, he and his men would row their boats into enemy harbours where there was French and Spanish shipping, and they would clamber aboard these ships in the middle of the night as silently as they could. They'd overpower the sentries, lock the crews down below, and they'd cut the anchor rope and they'd sail these ships out as prize ships and take them away. If they couldn't do that, they would just throw incendiary bombs onto these ships and try to burn them. And then the Spanish and the French realised what was happening. Orders went out that whenever there was an outgoing tide at night time, they had to triple the sentries on watch to watch out for Cochrane and his men. So once again, Cochrane changed his tactics. Whenever there was an incoming tide now, his men would row into these harbours. They'd either simply cut the anchor ropes and let these ships drift onto the rocks or onto the beach and ground them or damage them, or they'd throw incendiaries on board and try and damage the ships that way. So he had a lot of success during this time. But on one occasion, he was cornered by 3 French frigates. He had no opportunity to escape. He had to surrender the Speedy, and he was taken prisoner. the French admiral, a man by the name of Linnaeus, was so impressed with the stories of Cochrane that he invited Cochrane to dinner on several occasions just so that he could hear the adventures of Cochrane and the Speedy. He was so impressed by those stories. Now later, after a few days, Cochrane was exchanged as part of a prisoner exchange for a French captain. When Napoleon found out that the man that he called the Sea Wolf, that had caused so much damage to his fleets around the Mediterranean, had been exchanged for a mere French captain, he went into a rage. He wrote to Admiral Linnaeus, or sent the dispatches to Admiral Linnaeus, and said, "You're going to be executed, but you've got the choice. You can decide whether you're going to be executed for incompetence or for treason. It's your choice." Not much of a choice. Now, luckily for Linnaeus, he had achieved a great victory over the British in the meantime. So he was actually spared by Napoleon, and his name appears on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris even today. Now, in March 1802, peace was declared, the Peace of Amiens was signed, and Cochrane went back to university in Edinburgh to continue his studies. But peace wasn't going to last all that long, and in 1804, war with France broke out again. He was given command of HMS Pallas, which was a much larger vessel with 36 guns, much bigger and more powerful than the Speedy had. Now, back in those days, if you were a captain of a vessel, to get a crew, it was very hard to get and keep a crew because it wasn't a great life being a seaman in the Royal Navy. You'd have to send press gangs ashore to bring men to your ship and try and train them in seamanship. But because of his reputation for the amount of prize money that he won for his crew and the way he treated his crew, Cochrane had no such trouble at all. He just put an ad in the local newspaper advertising for men to come and join him to make a lot of money attacking the French and the Spanish. And down the bottom there, he could pick his own men. He said, "None need apply, but seamen or stout hands able to rouse about the field pieces and carry 100 weight of pewter without stopping for at least 3 miles." So he wanted the fittest, the best of the best, the cream of the British Navy to join him, and that's exactly what he got. And once again, he had a lot of success aboard Pallas. They was able to capture 5 French vessels and also destroy 5 other vessels as well. And then he was given command of HMS Imperius, which was once again much bigger and more powerful. And he was sent to the Iberian Peninsula in Spain to work along that coastline. Now, he developed more tactics this time. Down in that Iberian Peninsula of Spain, a British army landed there. Then they were trying to go ashore with reinforcements and with taking supplies ashore. And while they were doing that, they were extremely vulnerable. A large French army were advancing to attack the British. So Cochrane went ashore. He took some of his men ashore, and he was able to clamber up the walls during the middle of the night, the walls of what was known as the Fortress of Mongat, and he was able to take overpower the garrison and take the fort. This fort was at the crossroads, a very strategic crossroads, and he was able to hold that fort and stop that French advance for more than a month and gave that British army a chance to get organised and supplied, and probably saved that British army in doing so. And he also used to like to raid ashore and attack French semaphore stations. So these semaphore stations were huge sort of buildings where they had arms, mechanical arms that operated. Semaphore is the art of signalling using these arms, and each position of the arm indicates a different letter or number. And this was the way the French used to communicate with each other along the coastline. It was much faster than a horseman taking dispatches along. So Cochrane used to like to go ashore and burn these semaphore stations down, disrupting the French communications. On one occasion, he was actually able to capture a French code book, and instead of taking the code book with him, he copied it down, and he left the code book in the ruins of the semaphore station. The French didn't realise that their codes had been compromised, so they kept on using that code, and the English were able to read their signal traffic for over a month. And then on another occasion, he went ashore and he was able to clamber up the cliffs again, and he was able to capture Fort Trinidad, which once again was a very strategic fort in Spain, and he was able to hold that fort against much more superior French forces for several weeks. And when the French actually overcame the garrison and were into the fort, he was the last person to leave, and as he left, he lit a fuse and blew up the ammunition stores, which destroyed a lot of the fort. And you can see in this photo, this is a modern photo of Fort Trinidad, which is near the north of Spain. You can see the new sections of the fort because Cochrane had destroyed the other sections. Now, Cochrane was a particular hero of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was an admiral during World War II. Mountbatten was the head of British Special Operations, and he went to Churchill and he proposed a new type of fighting force based along some of the adventures that Cochrane had had. This fighting force was going to be able to raid against the enemy coastline, go ashore, disrupt communications and supply lines, and also perhaps capture enemy soldiers and bring them back for interrogation. And this became the Royal Marine Commandos, a famous fighting force, the Green Berets of the British Army. And these commandos were so successful that in 1942, Hitler issued the infamous Commando Order, which meant that even if you were in full uniform and you surrendered under the terms of the Geneva Convention, if you were captured behind enemy lines as a commando, you were considered to be a saboteur or a spy, and you were executed out of hand. And this is what happened to several hundred of these commandos. But Cochrane is seen to be one of the fathers of the Royal Marine Commandos. Sir Walter Scott, who was a famous British poet and author, had been a reporter on that Iberian Peninsula in Spain. He talked about Cochrane, and he wrote about the exploits of Cochrane, saying he kept the whole coast of Languedoc in alarm the whole time he was off the coast, and that he destroyed telegraphs of utmost importance to the French, preventing troops from that province to being sent to Spain, and that he excited so much dismay that 2,000 men were drawn from Figueras to oppose him, and that those men would otherwise have been marching further into Peninsula, attacking the British forces there. So he had a great influence on the successful outcome of the British campaign in that area. And then came the Battle of Basque Roads, and this is an extremely famous battle in British history. The French Mediterranean fleet were holed up in Basque Roads, which is a bay in the Bay of Biscay. They couldn't get out because the British Channel Fleet had blockaded them in. That Channel Fleet was just anchored outside the harbour, but they couldn't stay anchored outside the harbour forever. The Channel Fleet was under the command of a man by the name of Admiral James Gambier, whose men nicknamed him Dismal Jimmy because of his attitude. He was a very unadventurous man, he was a very pious man, and instead of training the men in how to use their guns and things, he would preach from the Bible to them for several hours each day. Now, Gambier would not attack the French in Basque Roads, and that disappointed a lot of his senior officers, but it also upset the people back at the Admiralty. Now, by this time, because of Cochrane's fame, he had been elected as the Member of Parliament for Westminster in London. He was having dinner at a restaurant one night when the First Lord of the Admiralty walked past his table and stopped. And he said, these Basque Roads, if you were in command, what would you do? So Cochrane cleared the table and he got an ink well and a quill, and he described what he would do if he was given command of a mission to attack Basque Roads. So the First Lord gave him command he was still going to be under the command of Gambier, but he gave Cochrane the job of attacking Basque Roads. Now, this infuriated a lot of British officers who were much more senior to Cochrane, including a man by the name of Captain Harvey, who was part of that Channel Fleet. Harvey had been one of the heroes, one of the 12 captains of Nelson, heroes of Trafalgar. He went to Gambier and accused him of incompetence. And he said of Gambier, "I never saw a man so unfit for the command of the fleet. If Admiral Nelson were here, he would not have anchored in Basque Roads at all, but would have dashed at the enemy at once." But Gambier would never do that. He was much, much too cautious to do that. Because of what he had said to his admiral, Captain Harvey, even though he was a hero of Trafalgar, was sent back to England for court-martial. But everyone was upset about this. But on April 11th, 1809, Cochrane was able to put his plan into force, and this was to send fire ships into Basque Roads and try and destroy the French. But it wasn't just fire ships, because he'd invented a brand new sort of weapon, and these were called bomb rafts. These were huge rafts that he had built, and on board each of these rafts were 1,500 barrels of gunpowder. And on top of those barrels of gunpowder were artillery shells and these new things called flares, which would hit a target, and they'd burn those targets when they hit it. So he sent these gunships and these bomb rafts into the harbour at Basque Roads, and the French panicked. A lot of French ships were destroyed by the fire ships, but most of the ships were destroyed because of sheer panic by the French. Captains just cut their anchor ropes and tried to escape by sailing out, but they were easily captured or destroyed by the British waiting out in the bay. But most of the French damage was done by ships that had to go forward into the bay itself and were grounded onto rocks or onto the beaches. Some ships were manoeuvrable, but most ships were not. So Cochrane sent a message to Gambier saying, "Now's the time to attack. We can destroy the whole French fleet if we attack now." But once again, Gambier vacillated. He wouldn't move on the French at all. So Cochrane, in frustration, he took his one ship and he went into the bay and he attacked 3 of the French ships that were grounded in that bay. He signalled for help from the rest of the fleet, but once again Gambier wouldn't move. And in the end, 5 captains disobeyed Gambier's orders, and they sailed in to help destroy some of these ships that Cochrane was fighting against. So most of the French fleet were destroyed during the Battle of Basque Roads, but some of them did escape as well. It was a great victory, but was also very much a lost opportunity. Now, back in England, Cochrane went to Gambier afterwards, and he accused Gambier of extraordinary hesitation, which is only one step down of accusing someone of outright cowardice. So he wasn't popular for doing that. But when Napoleon found out what had happened and that Gambier hadn't attacked, he said of Gambier that he was an imbecile. Now, Cochrane never said anything publicly about Gambier's actions that day. As far as the British press and the public and the Parliament were concerned, this was a great victory. They didn't know that it was also a wasted opportunity. So the Parliament decided that they were going to read out a letter of congratulations and thanks to Gambier for this great victory. Now, and they're also going to give him a cash prize. When Cochrane found out about this, he said that he would use his position in Parliament to stand up in Parliament to tell the truth about what had happened. Now, the Admiralty didn't want this. Gambier didn't want this. So Gambier said that he wanted a court-martial. He wanted himself to be court-martialed to see whether he had anything to answer for. The Admiralty couldn't have this. They didn't want this bad publicity. So they stacked that court-martial with supporters of Gambier. Anyone who was going to testify against Gambier was either transferred to Gibraltar or Malta or even as far away as Australia. And in the end, that court-martial found that Gambier had nothing to answer for. But once again, Cochrane wasn't happy. He'd made a lot of enemies during that time. And then came the Great Stock Exchange fraud of 1814. Now, on February the 21st of that year, a rumour started circulating around London that there'd been a great victory and that Napoleon was dead. Now, once this hit London, the stock exchange went skyrocketing through the roof, in particularly one government security called Omnium. Now, after a few hours, it was discovered that this hadn't happened at all. This was a hoax. And in the meantime, though, Cochrane, his uncle, and his financial advisor had sold their shares in Omnium, and they had made a £1.1 million profit on those shares. Now, I understand that £1.1 million is just pocket change for most of you, but back in those days, that was quite a lot of money, and people started pointing their finger saying, was Cochrane responsible for this? There was no evidence that he had anything to do with it whatsoever, but because he had so many enemies, both political and in the Admiralty as well, he was held accountable. He was put on trial, he was found guilty, he was sentenced to 12 months in prison, a £1,000 fine, he was dishonourably discharged from the Royal Navy, he was discharged from Parliament, he had his knighthood stripped from him, and he's most important to him at all that his family's banner was taken down from Westminster Abbey and removed from that, and that was an absolute disgrace. Now, he said that he had nothing to do with this whatsoever, and the general public believed him. So when there was a by-election to elect a new member for Westminster, even though he wasn't on the, he was also sentenced to 1 hour of public pillory in the stocks, but that was commuted because of his reputation. He was actually re-elected as the member for Westminster, even though his name wasn't on the ballot. People went into the ballots and they wrote his name on the ballot, so when the votes were counted, he actually had an increased majority than what he had had previously, but he wasn't allowed to take up his place in Parliament. He actually escaped while he was in prison by clambering down some bed sheets, and instead of going away and taking off, escaping somewhere, he went directly to Parliament and he demanded that he be able to take his seat, but instead he was taken back to prison to serve out the rest of his sentence. This is a cartoon or a caricature that was published in the newspapers at the time, and it shows the different aspects of it. On one side, you've got the great naval hero, and on the bottom there, at the ground there, his feet, is all the great victories that he's achieved as a naval hero. And then on the other side, you've got the crooked politician who swindled all this money. And on the ground there, you see his knighthood's been stripped and taken from him and thrown down. His epaulets have been taken from his uniform, indicating that he's been dishonourably discharged. His sword has been broken, also to say that he is discharged dishonourably. And that was the way he was. So he wasn't a very popular man amongst the politicians and the Admiralty back in London, but he was offered a lifeline in 1818. The Chilean independence forces were fighting for their independence against Spain, and he was offered the opportunity to command the Chilean Navy, and he accepted that. Now, the Chilean Navy wasn't such a navy. There was only 4 small ships. The men on these ships weren't very well trained, so Cochrane took some of his men from the Royal Navy with him, with the promise of being able to attack Spanish shipping once again and earn some money. And they retrained these Chilean sailors in the ways of the Royal Navy, and they were quite successful in attacking Spanish shipping and capturing some of those Spanish transport ships and things. But this is the way Chile was at the time. The ports along the coastline there, the inland areas of Chile were virtually under the control of the Chilean independence forces, headed by people like Simon Bolivar, Jose de San Martin, who we spoke about the other day, and Bernardo O'Higgins, which was an Irish person who fought for Chile's independence as well. But these coastal cities were impregnable. They couldn't be taken from the land, and they were considered also impregnable from the sea. But Cochrane decided that he was going to attack the biggest one of them at all, the city of Valdivia. He sailed for Valdivia, but along the way he discovered that his 5-year-old son, also named Thomas Cochrane, had stowed away aboard the ship, and that he wanted to go with his father. He was a chip of the old block. He wanted to fight the Spanish as well. Now, Valdivia was the most fortified city in all of South America. It could not be taken from either the land or from the sea, as I said, considered impregnable. So Cochrane reverted back to his old ways. He took 300 men and they clambered up the cliffs in the middle of the night, something that people thought was absolutely impossible. They overcame the garrison at the first fort and they locked the rest of the garrison below. And then they made their way. This is a modern day picture of these forts at Valdivia. They made their ways along these parapets along to the next fort, and they were able to get into the next fort and attack that and overcome that garrison as well. And then they kept on going through until they'd taken 4 forts. And when the Spanish heard what was happening, they deserted the other 3 forts. So Cochrane had captured all 7 forts which guarded the entrance to Valdivia, and the next day he was able to sail into Valdivia, and the Spanish had no choice. They had to surrender their most important, most powerful city in all of Chile, and the Chilean forces came in and Chile won their independence from Spain. And then he was given command of the Peruvian Navy. By this time he was nicknamed by the Spaniards El Diablo, or the Devil. And in 1820 he went to fight for the Peruvians in their battle for independence against the Spanish. Now, his reputation at this point was such that the Spanish most powerful ship, the Esmeralda, which had 44 guns, it was the most powerful ship in South America, wouldn't go out to confront Cochrane and his men, even though they had a much more powerful ship. They stayed under the protection of the shore batteries in Callao Bay, along that coastline of Peru. So once again, Cochrane reverted to his old tactics. He and his men rowed in the middle of the night. They clambered aboard the Esmeralda. They attacked the sentries. The sentry was actually able to give the alarm, and there was a big battle, and Cochrane was wounded in the thigh during that battle, but eventually he was able to take the Esmeralda. They cut the anchor ropes, and they were able to sail out, and they controlled the most powerful vessel in all of South America, and the Spanish were now cut off from land and by sea, and they had to surrender, and Peru gained their independence. And then he was given command of the Brazilian Navy, as you do. And they were fighting their war of independence against the Portuguese this time. Now, by this time, he was given command in March 1823. By this time, his reputation was so much that he didn't really have to fight anymore. He just bluffed his way through. He sailed his vessel into a heavily defended harbour. That was the harbour of Salvador. And he said to them, he virtually said, "I'm here to attack you." Because of his reputation, the occupants of the city, all the Portuguese occupants of the city, including all their senior officers, boarded the 34 Portuguese ships that were in the harbour, and they sailed out. They wanted to escape back to Portugal. Cochrane, in his ship, which was named the O'Higgins, gave chase, and one by one he was able to overtake and capture 30 of those ships and put prize crews aboard those ships and sail them to friendly ports, making a great fortune for himself along the way. And then he sailed up into another region of Brazil, Mariano, and he sailed in there, and he said, "If you don't surrender, I'm going to bring my fleet into the harbour and I'm going to destroy the city." He didn't have a fleet. He only really had 2 ships. And but they took the bait and they surrendered the city, and then the province. And then when the neighbouring province of Belém de Pala found out about this, they also surrendered as well. Now, he was made the Marquis of Mariano, and Brazilians gained their independence. And then he was given command of the Greek Navy. They were fighting for 400 years for their independence against the Ottoman Empire. But once again, when he arrived, his reputation was such a boost to the morale of the Greeks that they started fighting even harder. And eventually the British, the French, and the Russians decided that they would help the Greeks as well, and Cochrane didn't really have much part to play in the establishment of the Greek Empire. His father died, so on July 1st, 1831, he became the 10th Earl of Dundonald, and the following year he returned to Great Britain. Now, in the meantime, there'd been 3 separate inquiries by the Lord Chancellors, 3 separate Lord Chancellors, who was the highest legal person in Great Britain, and all 3 of these inquiries had found that he had not done anything wrong during that stock exchange fraud. There was no evidence against him, and that he was only convicted because of his political enemies. So he was given a full pardon. He was reinstated into the Navy. Queen Victoria restored his knighthood, and he became a Rear Admiral of the Blue. And over the next few years, he received 8 promotions until he became an Admiral of the Red. He died on October 31st, 1860, the day after his family's banner was restored to Westminster Abbey, and he is interred in Westminster Abbey. When we get to Valparaiso, this is a statue you'll see of him. He is more highly regarded and renowned in South America than he is in his native Britain. The Brazilian Navy, when he was buried in Westminster Abbey, they went along, and the officer in charge said, "We place these flowers on Lord Cochrane's grave in the name of the Brazilian Navy, which he created, and of the Brazilian nation whose independence and unity he rendered an incomparable service." There's 5 ships of the Chilean Navy named Cochrane in his honour, including a current warship that is named Cochrane. We might see that when we get to Valparaiso. And every year on Chilean Independence Day, there's a ceremony in Westminster Abbey commemorating their greatest naval hero. Napoleon called him the Sea Wolf. The Spanish called him the Devil. Horatio Hornblower is the novels and movies and books, the novels, the TV series, the movies that were created by C.S. Forrester are usually based on the life of Cochrane, the real life adventures of Cochrane, as are the Jack Aubrey of the Master and Commander and books and novels, movies as well. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of Lord Cochrane. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something from it, and I hope to see you around the ship. Thank you very much.